Welcome to today's session. Excited to be able to spend some time talking to you about this idea of resilience and emotional intelligence. And really, before we dive into the content, I'd like to have you think about two questions. The first is, what would it be like if we could positively impact our effectiveness, well-being, and the quality of our relationships? Now, if we think about effectiveness, we're thinking about results. We're thinking about setting and meeting goals. When we think about well-being, really what we're talking about is mental and physical health. And when we're talking about the quality of our relationships, we mean the quality of our relationships both inside and outside work. And our belief is that emotional intelligence and resilience have a huge impact on these three things. So that, again, one of the things we'll be exploring is what can we do to have this positive impact, as well as what would it be like if we could take back some of the tools, tips, techniques to help those around us, both inside and outside work. Throughout the course of our webinar series, the Transform webinar series, we'll look at today, resilience and emotional intelligence. In July, we'll look through the lens of coaching. What are some of the things that I can do to create and nurture a coaching culture? And then in August, we'll look at what are some strategies for combating change fatigue inside organizations. I work for an organization called Bluepoint Leadership Development. I guess it's the past 2 decades, have been working with leaders all over the world. We work with leaders in every different industry, from retail to financial services to healthcare, large organizations and small organizations. And we work with these leaders on topics like EQ, coaching, communication, leading change, leading innovation, building high performance teams. We work with them one-on-one through executive coaching, small group, cohorts, large group open enrollments, keynote addresses, looking to build leadership skills, capabilities inside organizations. I've been with Bluepoint for, almost 17 years, and I've been in the leadership development space for over 30 years. I stay in the space because I'm passionate about the work I do. I'm excited to be able to spend an hour with you. And I also stay in the space because I've seen leadership make a difference. I've seen it make a difference inside organizations. I've seen it make a difference inside teams. I've seen it make a difference inside families and communities. So again, delighted to be able to spend some time with you looking at this first part of the Transform series around resilience and emotional intelligence. Our intention is to share some research, to share some tools, some best practices, some tips for you and for you to bring back with you. I'd like to start with this data point, if you will. And this data point comes from an organization called 6 Seconds, and they spend tons of time researching EQ. That's their only subject matter. And what they found is that people high in EQ are 10 times more likely to have high scores on effectiveness, well-being, and relationships. So we know that EQ matters. There's also other studies in all different industries that shows us that EQ makes a difference. This one is from healthcare. Emotional intelligence has been called one of the largest drivers of patient safety. And if we look at what skills are most important moving forward from the World Economic Forum Future of Work, 80% of the top skills that they believe will be necessary for individuals in 2025 are EQ skills. And it makes sense. We're in times of great change, and emotional intelligence and leadership matter. My guess is most of you know what EQ is. And my guess is most of you have an understanding of the history and where it comes from. Daniel Goleman, probably the most recognized name associated with EQ. Here's how he defines emotional intelligence: the capacity for recognizing our own feelings and those of others, for motivating ourselves, for managing emotions well in ourselves and in our relationships. For those of you, again, who recognize why he's so important to the field of EQ, what we were looking to do, we're going back decades, 3 decades ago, what we were looking to do is find what predicted success inside organizations. And we thought it was IQ for a while, then we recognized IQ wasn't the biggest predictor of success. And Daniel Goleman really started to look at this idea of EQ being the biggest predictor of success inside organizations. So we know it matters and we know what it is. And we also know currently there's some bad news associated with globally how we're doing with our EQ. The State of the Heart survey, which is again put out by that organization called 6 Seconds, what they found is that our EQ has declined for 4 consecutive years in every factor of emotional intelligence. So some pretty significant bad news as they look at EQ globally. They did find there's some pockets of good news. There's the gender difference. So women tend to be bouncing back a little more quickly than men. And in generations, the Gen Z, which is ages 13 to 27 about, tends to be not doing so well around EQ. Almost 54% scored themselves low in satisfaction, which has a high correlation with burnout and disengagement. Different industries score differently. So the interesting part about their research was, yes, all factors declined, but the 3 largest declines have to do with our ability to move forward in challenging times. And the 3 that are bulleted there. One is, again, our largest decline is in exercise optimism. Exercise optimism is proactively having the perspective of hope and possibility. Engaging intrinsic motivation, that is gaining energy from personal values, recognizing what lights me up as opposed to being lit up or energized by external forces. And the last one is around pursuing noble goals. Bit of a correlation there. That's around connecting our daily choices to our overarching purpose, what matters to us. So again, the 3 largest declines in those areas. One of the other things, and I think this is kind of a bit scary, is that 6 Seconds said in their report that came out this year, the world has entered an emotional recession, and they defined it like this: sustained reduction of people's emotional energy. And all we have to do is look around most organizations to see that. I mean, tons of data that supports the fact that we see this every day. 77% of professionals have experienced work-related burnout in the past year. Workplace stress is at record levels, but only 46% of employees take their vacation time. 64% of all employees are dealing with some sort of mental behavioral health challenges. There is some good news, and that's why we're spending our time here today. The good news is that EQ can readily be increased. What we know is that it's not fixed genetically. Our IQ is pretty much fixed at a certain age. Our EQ seems to be largely learned. It continues to develop as we go through life and learn from our experiences. It increases with experience, awareness, education, discipline, and a bit of humility. So my hope is that some of the thoughts we can share today will start to add to your own awareness. My hope is that you'll bring some of this back. How can we as HR professionals educate others inside and outside work so that we can start to build back up the EQ that has declined globally over the past 4 years? So when we work with our clients, when we talk about EQ, one of the things that we typically start with is this true or false statement. And the statement is this: humans can, and at times need to, eliminate emotions from their decision making. And one of the things that we typically ask our clients to do is say, okay, if you had to argue this as a true statement, what would you say? And if you had to argue this as a false statement, what would you say? And I'll ask you to think about that. If you had to argue this as true, how would you argue it as true? What would be some of the things that you might say? And if you were to argue this as false, how might you argue it as a false statement? And I'll share with you some of the things that we typically hear. So we typically start with the true statement. So if I wanted to argue this as true, here's probably the most popular response is, well, there are times where I need to make a decision and I need to take my emotions out of it. hiring decisions, termination decisions, decisions around tough conversations. My guess is many of us can really resonate with that there are times where, yeah, I kind of need to make a logical decision and I need to take my emotion out of it. And my guess is everyone on this call, if I were to ask you this question, how many of you have ever made a decision when you were really angry that you later regretted? My guess is most people would raise their hand. Have you ever made a decision and you were crazy in love that you later regretted? My guess is most hands are going to go up in the room. So because of that, we want to say this is a true statement. Those who argue it as a false statement say this. They say we can't really eliminate it. Our emotions are part of everything we do. And it is, in fact, a false statement. Reason without emotion is neurologically impossible. Our brain takes an information, and the first part of our brain that it hits is the emotional part of our brain, the amygdala. We have less than half a second to decide whether it's going to eat me or I'm going to eat it. It's our fight or flight mechanism. Less than half a second to send that information to the thinking part of our brain. So emotion, then thought. So if we look at, well, what does it look like? We take in information through our brainstem, less than half a second, it hits that amygdala, and we have less than half a second to send that information to the thinking part of our brain. And that's what has kept us alive. It's a fight or flight mechanism. So EQ is about managing that amygdala. It's about managing that emotion when I take it in so that I send accurate information to the neocortex, the thinking part of the brain. So really we feel before we think. And inner strength, EQ, comes from the amygdala, the feeling part of our brain, being on good speaking terms with the thinking part of our brain. So I'll ask you to think about, and I'm going to ask you to think about these characteristics and to think about your team or your organization. And as I go through these, I'll ask you to identify which of these do you see frequently inside your team, your organization, and which maybe you not see as frequently. And really this gets at, how do you know if you, your team, or those around you have high EQ? And again, this isn't an exhaustive list. Really, it's certain characteristics associated with teams, organizations, cultures where there's high EQ. The first is this: empathy and compassion are clearly visible inside the organization. Here's what that looks like. It could look like when I'm dealing with customers or outside clients, I can put myself in their shoes and I can display compassion for them. It could look like when I look around the organization, I see team members supporting one another and being able to know what it's like in the other person's shoes. So that's the first one: empathy and compassion clearly visible. The second is psychological safety is high. And my guess is, what that looks like. It looks like difficult conversations happen. I see something and I'm not afraid to bring it up, even if it's inside another part of the business, or even if it's delivering bad news up inside the organization. The third is collaboration is clearly evident. That looks like, in post-pandemic, we found that when many of us were fully remote, collaboration suffered. We kind of held on to what was ours, and we didn't share a lot, and we tended not to collaborate outside of our direct team. So inside organizations with high EQ, we see collaboration as evident. I'm willing to offer to others. I'm willing to invite others to participate and give their thoughts and their ideas. I'm willing to be open-minded. Again, collaboration clearly evident. The next is individuals are inspired and energized about their work. When you look around your team and organization, what do you see? Do you see people who are passionate about what they're doing? Do you see people who come in like ready to work and energized about what faces them that day? And the next and last is this: there's a sense of optimism for the future. When you look again inside your team, inside your organization, do you see hope? Do you see people talking about what tomorrow could be? Do you see people being really proactive about building a future that's better than today inside the organization? So if you look at the list, again, not an exhaustive list, but 5 things that we see inside teams, organizations with high EQ. I'm going to ask you if you would to use that Slido, that chat pod, that Q&A pod. And I would love for you to identify in the chat pod 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Which of these would you say, when you look around your team or organization, you see the most frequently? And maybe it's one of them, maybe it's 2 of them. Which of these, again, using that chat pod, would you say you see most frequently? Which do you, in your opinion, do you think is the one that shows up most frequently inside your team or organization? Again, would love for you to chime in. The other thing that I'll also invite you to put into the chat pod is which shows up least frequently. Like which of these maybe is an opportunity for you to look around and say, okay, I need to build that a little more. So any thoughts, again, would love for you to be able to share with each other in the chat pod some of what you're facing and some of what you're seeing, positive and not so positive, around you inside the organization. When we look at EQ, we look at exploring really 4 competencies, 4 behaviors, 4 skill sets, 4 dimensions associated with emotional intelligence. And this is what we'll look at today. The first is around personal awareness. It's around emotions. It's around traits. It's around triggers. The second is around self-mastery. That's impulse control. It's around adaptability and resilience. The third is around leadership connections, empathy, transparency, and service. And the fourth is around influencing others, optimism, confidence, and inspiration. We won't have time to go through every one of those. We will look at all 4 competencies, and we'll look at 1 or 2 associated with each. And we'll start with personal awareness. Specifically in personal awareness, we'll look at emotions, and we'll look at a little bit of triggers, but mostly we'll spend our time on emotions. And so grateful of you all using the chat box. Somebody just asked where the chat box is. So if I could invite someone to help the group find where the chat box is. Well, you must know where it is because you just asked the question in it. So again, grateful for your participation in the chat box, the Slido box, the Q&A box, because we'll use that as we go throughout the presentation. As we look at the first piece around personal awareness, let's take a look at emotions. It's a huge part of emotional intelligence, of course. And one of the questions that I typically ask our clients is, okay, if you had to number how many emotions you think there are, how many would you guess? And I'll ask you to think the same way. If you had to guess how many emotions there are, how many would you say? And you can put it in the chat pod if you like, into the polling and Q&A pod. Would love to hear some of the responses. So again, it's a question that we ask frequently, and I'd love to see some of the responses because I hear a wide range of responses. I hear anywhere from, Joan, I know exactly how many there are 2, to I know exactly how many there are 408. So I typically hear loads of different kinds of responses, like how many emotions are there? And then I of course have the Disney fans in the room who will say, Joan, I know exactly how many emotions there are because I saw Inside Out and there are 5, and these are those. And then if anybody knows that if you haven't seen Inside Out, watch it. It is meant to be a children's movie. It's not a children's movie. It's about EQ. It's fascinating. It's about the emotions that we kind of struggle with every day. Well, for those of you with teenagers, Inside Out 2 is coming out, and it deals with the main character is now a teenager. So Disney had to add a few emotions to the mix. So here's what we know about emotions. We know that there aren't just 2 or 5 or 12, as Disney wants to tell us, that there are hundreds of them. And there are derivatives of each emotion. One researcher got to over 400 and stopped counting. Yet when I asked this question to some of the groups that I work with, if you had to identify just 2 emotions, which 2 would you pick? And I'll ask you to kind of have thoughts in your head. If you had to just pick 2 emotions, which 2 would you pick? And I would say 90% of the time, people say happy, sad. So we know there are hundreds of emotions, yet we go to happy, sad. When we ask others to sort of identify, okay, what are the emotions, happy, sad, we go right to those 2. Emotions have an enormous influence in our lives. We feel before we think. They're neither good nor bad, but they really provide important information on what's going on around us. EQ, it's not about denying our emotions. It's about accepting that they exist. It's about understanding them and then being able to manage our responses to them. So we think about this idea that we take in 60,000 thoughts daily. Every one is connected to an emotion. So if we are equipped at identifying the emotion when it's triggered, when it's spiked, we're much better able to handle that emotion. So I'm going to ask you to think about this. When you're at your best, and if those of you who are people leaders, I'll ask for you to think about you at your best as a leader. What emotions, and those of you who aren't people leaders, simply take out as a leader. When you're at your best, what emotions are you experiencing? Would love again for you to engage using that chat pod, using that Slido polling Q&A. When you're at your best, and for those of you who are leaders, when you're best as a leader, what emotions are you experiencing? Like, can you name the emotions that you're feeling when you feel at your best? So again, I'll ask you to kind of think about, okay, can I name the emotion, not just happy? Is there a derivative of that? What are some of the things that you're experiencing? And there's lots of ways to sort of help ourselves identify this specific emotion. Dr. Gloria Wilcox has a feeling wheel, and it's on the screen here. There's also Susan David has one as well, something similar in her book, Emotional Agility. And the intention here is to help us really identify the emotion, bit of a cheat sheet, if you will. It's okay, I'm not just happy when I'm at my best. Maybe I'm grateful. Maybe I'm proud. Maybe I'm excited. Like, once I can start to really get to what is that emotion, I'm much better able to track it, choose my next step, know what the best course of action is for myself. So one more I'm going to invite you to think about. And this one is when you're reflecting on a challenging or stressful situation that you're facing. What emotions are you feeling here? So again, it could be something at work. It could be something outside of work. What emotions are you experiencing as you think about whatever that challenge is? And my hope is, again, you go past I feel sad or I feel stressed. Like, what is the emotion? And again, there's an opportunity to look at, whether it's Dr. Gloria Wilcox's feeling wheel or others. Is it anxious? Is it I'm feeling that I'm not enough, that I don't have the information I need? Like, what is it that, maybe something positive, maybe I'm curious. So once we start to recognize, okay, I'm stressed. Well, what's the emotion? Okay, I'm this, I'm that. Once we recognize what the emotion is, and you likely have heard this, once I name the emotion, I start to tame it. And there's science that supports this. If we looked at an image of a brain, once I start to name the emotion, I'm anxious, it actually tames the amygdala. So you'll see the brain imaging changes when I name that particular emotion. So that's how I start to manage my emotions, by naming them. So I have a teenage daughter, and I don't know if any of you have teenagers, have experienced teenagers, or know any teenagers. This is a really helpful skill for them because they tend to be on an emotional roller coaster. Comes with the age, etc. And I kind of laugh with my daughter because she's so delighted that I do this for a living, and she'll be in one of her moods, and sometimes she just looks at me and she'll say, like, I don't even want to name it, right? Like, but if you think about it, the fact that she even goes there, right, it starts to help her to adjust. It happens in work as well. I mean, think about the highs and lows we experience at work. Once we start to name the emotion, we actually start to tame it. We start to manage it. Again, I recognize it's a simple strategy. It's not an easy strategy, because once you name it, the next thing is asking yourself, well, do I want to continue being really angry? And if not, then what will I do? But it helps us to be able to choose our path as opposed to our path choosing us. So here's a try this for you, someone at home, others at work. ask yourself, okay, what am I feeling? What's the emotion? And here's the second part of that. We find if you write it down, and of course, this isn't write it down every time, but if you have a spike in emotion, positive or negative, and you write it down, what you may start to see is some patterns. And once we recognize patterns, we can recognize triggers. And once we recognize triggers, we start to recognize, well, what do I need to do in order to manage that trigger? Again, positive or not so positive. Like, what are some of the things? Is it certain people? Is it certain situations? How can I start to manage it before it gets to an emotional spike that's not helpful for me? Like to spend just a bit of time. So we talked about that first dimension around personal awareness. We looked at emotions, a little bit on triggers. When we talk about self-mastery, like to spend just a little bit of time on this idea of resilience. And when we look at resilience, one of the questions that we typically ask our clients is true or false? One is born with resilience. So I'll ask you just to kind of think through this. Do you think you're born with resilience? And you spend any time with us and you know our true false statements are always false. We wouldn't be looking at resilience if we didn't think we could do something about it. Resilience is not genetic or instinctive. It's a learned response to adversity and challenge. It requires intention, practice, discipline to develop the skills to be resilient. So when we look at resilience, we'll look at it, there's many different lenses through which you can build resilience. We'll look at two lenses. We'll look at mindset and meaning today. Again, not the only two that you can look at to build resilience. When we look at mindset, I don't think you can talk about resilience. I don't think you could talk about mindset without talking about Carol Dweck and the work that Carol Dweck has done with fixed and growth mindset. My guess is many of you are familiar with her work. The difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset is on the screen. Fixed mindset, the tendency to believe that our talents, our intelligence, our habits can never be changed. Growth mindset, tendency to believe that we can develop our intelligence, we can learn, we can grow. Of course, her work was done initially with children. And how can we help children to see that they can, if they put the work in, they can grow different abilities? And organizations started to say, hey, we see fixed mindset with the adults inside our organizations. Can we bring that in here? And to me, again, there's lots of ways that we can develop a growth mindset, both with children and with adults inside organizations. But one of the simple tips is that as simple as a one word that she uses, and it's the power of yet. And my guess is many of you have heard this as well. It's when we hear ourselves with a fixed mindset saying, I'm no good at that. Oh gosh, I'll never be good at presenting. I'm not a P&L person. It's can we attach the word yet to that? Oh, you know what? I'm not good at presenting yet. But if I put the work in, might I be able to be able to give a presentation? You know what? I'm not so good at accounting yet. What if I learned about what that is? And I see this with my children that so frequently they'll say, I'm not a math kid. I'm not a science kid. Well, you're not a math or science kid yet. What are some of the things that we can do to start to change our mind, to open our mind, to be free to learn, grow, and develop? And one of the suggestions that I typically give to our clients is put the word yet on a post-it note somewhere in your office, because throughout the course of the day, the likelihood is something will come up where you or someone else will show up with a fixed mindset. And can we challenge ourselves and others with the power of yet? One of the try this is this comes right from Carol Dweck. She asked parents to challenge their children at the end of the day with, what did you learn today? What mistake did you make that taught you something? What did you try really hard at today? I think this is even, to me, for us individually, can we at the end of the day challenge ourselves to, what did we learn today? You know, did anything, do we struggle with anything? And, you know, what did that teach us? And what did we try really hard at? What effort did we put in today? This can help us as adults and those around us start to build this really appetite for growth and development and learning, which again trickles into this idea of learning resilience. The other lens that I'd like to look at resilience through is this idea of meaning and purpose. And that feeds into some of what the research saw the biggest declines in EQ was around intrinsic motivators and noble goals. Um, Viktor Frankl, my guess is many of you know of Viktor Frankl or know the name Viktor Frankl, wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. And he, for those of you who don't know the name, was a Holocaust survivor and psychologist, and spent really his life's work looking at this idea of that those who can have a why to live can bear with almost anyhow. He felt that his why got him through the Holocaust. I mean, the most unbelievably awful thing, I mean, that any one human could face. And he felt that because he had purpose, and his purpose was, he felt like the work he was doing in the psychology field and his love for his wife got him through the most unbelievable, horrible times. And I'll ask you just to think for a moment. My guess is many of you have done value sorts. You've spent time thinking about your values. How long has it been for you to think about what are your values? What are your core ideals? As you look at this list, and whether it's this list or it's a list that you have, or it's a card sort that you do, I'll ask you just to spend a moment now to take a look at those ideals on the screen. Which of these make you tick? Which of these, if you could only pick 5, are most important for you? What are your core ideals? And if you haven't spent time looking at your values recently, I invite you to spend some time after this session digging in, thinking through what is my why? What are the things that are most important to me? And after that, I'll invite you to look around you at those individuals most important to you inside and outside work. Do you know what their why is? And if you don't, how are you going to find out? You know, I typically ask the groups I'm with, okay, if you don't know what their whys are, how do you find out? And most people say, well, you could ask them, and you could. I think we just need to listen differently. People talk about their values all day long. Can we hear them? Can we listen for what motivates people internally? And then can we tap into that again as parents, as leaders, as coworkers, as community members? Can we recognize that what makes us tick, that our values are probably different than the person who's sitting next to you? One of my favorite quotes, and this is by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who much of the work that she did was in death and our overcoming some of the grief associated with that. And what she said was this, and I think it's so beautiful. People are like stained glass windows. They sparkle and shine when the sun is out. But when the darkness sets in, their true beauty is revealed only if there's a light from within. And I believe resilience is about knowing what those core ideals, what those values are for us. And in times of toughness, are we able to tap into those? Are we able to reignite the things that get us out of bed every day? And I think as leaders, as parents, as community members, if we see others who maybe aren't shining as brightly as they typically do, can we look to reignite their core values, their core ideals, so that they start to bounce back as well? I'd like to shift. So we talked about personal awareness, self-mastery. I'd like to spend just a few minutes looking at leadership connections, specifically around empathy and a light touch on service. So if we look at empathy, and we look at this idea of, can you have too much empathy? Sometimes, especially in the healthcare field, we hear, well, can you have too much empathy? And some of the research supports that if you're coming home with really feeling everyone else's emotions, then yes, you can. You need to set boundaries. But I don't believe that we can do too much of this, that we can do too much of listening empathetically. So we'll try this around empathy. That is getting in the shoes of others. Really 5 practices. The first is getting present, which again, I think so difficult, especially remote and hybrid work environments. How do I get present? Am I able to be completely with that other person in the moment? The second is letting the other person know that they're important to you. Are you able to somehow honor them in some way? somehow in a conversation, let them recognize that they matter to you. The third is traditionally what we say is empathy, putting ourselves in their shoes. In that moment, can you really see things from their side of the table? The fourth is, and this is so important, is listening for emotions, values, aspirations, passions, disappointments, not just for the words. I think so often we get so caught up in when we're in a conversation, I listen for what I need to hear, and then I share what I need to share, but I don't actually listen past the words. We find when we listen past the words, we start to get to know what it's really like to be that person. And the fifth is around inviting silence. That is so many valuable, there's so much valuable space for silence. And we typically, especially in a Zoom Teams environment, we tend to shut the silence out. But silence enables us to think. It enables us to listen differently because I don't have to have prepared what I'm going to say next, right when you finish speaking. I can be okay with a pause. So I'll ask you to look at this list. And again, if you're inclined, would love for you to use the chat pod. Love for you to identify which of these would you say is your greatest strength. My guess is most of us have at least one. My guess is many of these that come naturally for us. So if you had to say 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, which of these your greatest strength? And then next, I'll ask you to put into the chat pod as well. Which of these today are you going to spend time really concentrating on? I need to make time and space to do 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Then I'll share mine with you. So the one that comes most naturally for me is 5. I tend to be okay with silence. I tend to be more on the introverted side, so I'm okay with 5. And the one that I need to be really intentional about is getting present. I tend to have lots of things distracting me, inside and outside work. So I need to be really disciplined about getting present with others. So again, if you're so inclined, would love for you to share in the chat pod, which for you is a strength, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe there's multiple, and which is the one or ones that you want to be really intentional about looking at practicing, being really intentional about practicing when you leave here. I had mentioned this before, that sometimes the question comes up, can you have too much empathy? And research studies have said that yeah, some people do come home really leaving work with the feelings, the emotions of everyone at work. And if that is you, then there is a responsibility. You have a responsibility to really set some boundaries for yourself, to be thoughtful about, okay, it's about identifying emotions, the piece we already talked about, and how do I put up a boundary for myself so that I don't take this with me. When we talk about empathy in action, we talk about compassion and service as empathy in action. This is a try this exercise. It's one of my favorite exercises, and we won't have time to do it here. It's more of a, let me leave you with a thought, and my hope is that you'll have time to do this when you leave here. The intention is for you to identify 6 people most important to you and your success. My suggestion would be to pick some people inside work and some people outside of work. And then exercise empathy and think about each one individually. And as you think about that person and you put yourself in that person's shoes, identify one thing that you can do to serve them. What's one thing that they would want more of from you that you're not currently doing? Like what is it that it could be, and you see some examples on the screen, that they just want more of your time. Maybe it's that they want you to make a connection with someone else in the organization or help them network. Maybe it's they want you to coach them. Maybe it's they want you to teach them something, or for you to delegate something to them so that they could get practice in it. This practice of service and really thinking about the people who are most important to us gets us really in the discipline of being empathetic and serving and really being able to be compassionate in the moment. The last piece, the last competency that I'd like to spend some time on is around influencing others. And specifically, we'll talk about optimism. And whenever I do this piece, I always start with this question, and I kind of laugh and take a deep breath every time I share it with a group. This is about recognizing, is the room better when you enter it, or is the room better when you leave it? And my guess is that everyone on this call, the room is sometimes better when we enter it. We bring energy and positivity and passion into the room. My guess is every single one of us, the room is sometimes better when we leave it because we suck out the energy. We kind of bring in some toxicity, whatever it is. EQ, emotional intelligence, is about recognizing the difference and being able to manage it. Like if I realize that I'm sucking that energy out, I need to start to manage my own behavior. I need to start to manage the impact I'm having on others. And part of that comes from our optimistic bias. So it's a piece of it. And this idea of optimism, there has been a ton of research on optimism. And here's what we do know about optimism. We know that our moods matter. The book Resonance, which came out quite a number of years ago, one of the statistics that was in it still sort of strikes me today, is that up to 30% of productivity can be attributed to the leaders or the team's optimistic bias. So our moods matter. Our optimistic bias as a leader impacts the mood of our team, impacts the productivity of our team. And here's sort of the scary part. The research also tells us that some of us are not born with an optimistic bias. There's actually a piece of our brain that some of us are not born with. We're actually born, some of us, glasses half empty. And it's something that we can change. Here's what we've also learned through science. We learn that we can actually change how our brain thinks, and we can start to trigger it to be more optimistic. Lots of different strategies to do that. One of the things that I'd like to talk about is some of the work that Martin Seligman did around this idea of optimism. Learned optimism is what he talks about, and how we deal with adversity specifically. And what he said was that how we explain adversity is one of the most important factors in building emotional intelligence and resilience. He calls it our explanatory skills. So if we're facing a tough time, if we're facing adverse conditions, how we explain that to ourselves is an important factor in how we show up in the situation. And he talks about it through the lens of 3 Ps. And I'd like to share those with you and then share a few thoughts on those. The first is it's not personal. So sometimes when we're explaining an adversity to ourselves, we sometimes may say, this is happening because of me, right? Oh my gosh, it's my fault because of me. This is all going wrong. I mean, what he says is we need to find a way to explain it to ourselves where it's not personal. The second P is it's not pervasive. And this is just because this is happening to me doesn't mean that it pervades every aspect of my life. So, I burned my kids' breakfast doesn't mean I'm a terrible mother. So it's recognizing when I start to explain adversity using pervasive language, like everything is awful. And the third P is around it's not permanent. Just because I'm feeling awful now does not mean a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, I'll feel exactly the same way. It's not permanent. So I think part of what we can do for ourselves, for those around us as leaders, is start to change the conversation. When we hear, this is extreme, but when we hear individuals using this kind of language, it's my fault, my whole life is, and it's always going to be, we can start to be more coach-like. We can start to help them change their language. Specifically too in the personal pieces, just because it happened to you doesn't mean it happened because of you. Or what part of this isn't your fault? What part of this do you own? What part of it do you not own? Are we able to help ourselves and others start to change how we explain adversity that's going on? The pervasive piece is, really getting into, okay, what is being impacted by what's happening? What's not being impacted? What can I control? What can I control? Then the permanent piece is really looking at, what do I want to do? How can I accomplish? How can I move forward? How will I celebrate success? The try this is really Martin Seligman's learning from the research, the work that he did on optimism, was to remind ourselves that personal peace, my effort will make a difference. That pervasive peace, it's not changing everything. And that permanent peace, this will not last forever. Many of you likely have seen this quote. I do like this in relation to learned optimism. Watch your thoughts, they become your words. Watch your words, they become your action. Watch your actions, they become your habits. I think many of us can be helpful for ourselves and those around us by helping, again, ourselves and others change our thoughts and our words. Starting to shift the way we think about things to a more positive, a more productive thought pattern and language pattern. Cognitive reframing is a way, sort of a name given to how we can start to think and choose different words for what we're experiencing. And one of the examples that sort of struck me was, I have teacher friends, and I had never heard the term Sunday scaries. I don't know if any of you have, but my teacher friends would talk about the Sunday scaries, and they're like, Joan, it's on Sunday evenings. And we say to ourselves, gosh, I thought I was going to get so much done this weekend. I didn't get anything done. And then I think about the week and all the lesson plans I have to get done and all the parents I need to talk to. And then they said the constant sort of your mind just keeps going that you don't sleep. And they call them Sunday scares. And I'm like, like sometimes it doesn't have to be Sunday. Like my mind starts to do that. Well, cognitive reframing is about changing our thoughts too. Well, maybe we don't call it Sunday scaries. Like maybe we say, okay, let's look at it from how do we reframe it so that it's more helpful? Here's what I did get accomplished over the weekend. I can feel really good about that. Here's what I need to get done on Monday. And here's what I'll do first thing in the morning. So that it's reframed in a more positive, bite-sized bundle so that I can actually move it forward. So cognitive reframing, again, is a way for us to start to think differently. We explored 4 competencies. I recognize that we spent just a little bit of time in each one. When we look at developing EQ, really we're looking at an awareness, which my hope is the last 45 minutes got you thinking about what for you might be a good takeaway. What are some of the things that you might do to help yourself or those around you? And then it's around making commitments. What am I going to be really intentional about practicing so that I can start to develop habits in whatever it is that you're looking to develop? As we start to close, I'd like to share some of these we've already talked about, but some specific habits that can help to accelerate EQ for you and those around you. The first is tune into your feelings, thoughts, internal dialogues, and modify accordingly. This is around naming it to tame it. This is around the learned optimism. This is around the cognitive reframing. Can you really be in tune to what you're feeling? Can you be in tune to what you're telling yourself? And then reframe it in a way that's really helpful as opposed to not being so helpful. The second is get really clear on your core values, your beliefs, your intentions. What is it that lights you up inside? What are the things that make you tick? And again, that hits intrinsic motivators and pursue noble goals, which are the 2 biggest declines in EQ globally. The third is, are you able to build capacity for additional forgiveness, for open-mindedness, and for acceptance? Once we let go of holding a grudge, we free our mind up, we free ourselves up to be more open. And I'll ask you to try this for yourself. Like, who might you need to give forgiveness to? Like, think about people inside and outside work. Who do you need to kind of free up some internal space for yourself? Who do you need to forgive? And is there anyone you need to ask forgiveness from? Once we start to let go of some of those emotions that don't serve us, we start to again create space for more productive emotions. Habit number 5 is practicing mindfulness and reflection. This again is just recognizing what that internal dialogue is for us. Reflecting on how far have I come? Reflecting on, like, what am I experiencing in the moment? This is around triggers. It's around, it says cool your hot buttons. It's really recognizing what those hot buttons are. So by naming it to tame it, writing it down, and recognizing our triggers, we start to cool our hot buttons. And I'll ask you just to spend a moment thinking about, okay, how would you complete this? It makes me angry when. Hate it when. I'm offended when I get embarrassed when. Like once we start to recognize the patterns or the themes or the triggers, we're better able to manage them. We're better able to choose our next step as opposed to it choosing us. And the sixth habit is letting go. There are some times that we hold on to things that prevent us from moving on. Are we able to let go? Are we able to recognize what are the things that we hold on to that we need to let go of? And what are the things that, if we did let go of, again, would free us up? So those six, again, are listed on this slide. My invitation to you is to spend the next 30 seconds. Take a look at this list. Which of these do you want to be more intentional about? Which of these would serve you and those around you better if you're able to practice them? And if you're able to start to build habits around them. Again, just some habits to take away with you. I'd like to close with a story. The story, some of you may know the story. It's the story of the two wolves. A granddaughter approached her grandmother and she asked her grandmother, "Grandma, what is it like to be you?" And the grandmother said, "Well, within me lives two wolves. There's a good wolf, and the good wolf is humility and sympathy and compassion and kindness. And within me also lives a not so good wolf. And that wolf is envy and resentment and greed and impatience." And she said, and every day these two wolves battle. And the granddaughter said, "Well, which wolf wins?" And the grandmother said, the one that wins is the one whom I feed. And my hope for all of you is that you start to think about, okay, what are the things that I need to feed for myself? And what are the ways that I can help feed those around me, specifically in the realm of emotional intelligence and resilience? Again, my invitation to you is to start to think about, who do you feed? How might you continue to learn, grow, and develop in the field of emotional intelligence? I'm so grateful that you spent the hour with us. We would love to invite you to our next two webinars. The one on the coaching culture is on July 30th, and then the one on combating change fatigue is on August 13th. If you'd like to connect with us, my email is there, our email is there, our social media is there. We would be grateful for the connection. Again, thank you so much. If we can be helpful in any way, please reach out. Please let us know what we can do to serve in any way. I am going to pass this back over to Nicole.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing this information and presentation with us today. That presentation gave excellent actionable tips and advice on building emotional intelligence for ourselves and others. And I know for sure that I'm signing up for the next ones. Just a reminder to our HCI members, today's webcast has been approved for HRCI and SHRM credit, as well as for HCI recertification. Your credits for attending this webcast will soon show up in your My HCI profile under the transcript tab. While you're there, don't forget to check out hci.org for even more insights, as well as information on our certifications, virtual conferences, premium membership, and more. I'd like to say one more thank you to our presenter today and to the people at Bluepoint Leadership. And I'd also like to thank you, our webcast attendee. Thanks for spending an hour with us, and we'll see you next time.